Namaste and welcome to Delving Into Asian Psyches, the podcast in which we investigate the past, presence, and futures of psychology in the Indo-Pacific. My name is Robin Weber, and today I'm joined by Baiju Gopal from India. So first things first, I would like to introduce today's guest. Baiju Gopal is a psychology professor at Christ University in Bangalore. He's got 20 years of experience in research and teaching and is an affiliate of the Indian Psychoanalytical Society in Kolkata. He has written several studies on cultural psychology, migration and relationships, and has contributed to several publications on cultural counseling and psychotherapy, and he's also published his own book on playback theater. He doesn't only write but also acts himself, most recently in the Mahabharata project, and he also directs his own documentaries, as in last year's Gods from Inferno, which highlights indigenous cultures in Kerala. Now, India is a country, of course, that everybody heard of plenty before. It is the most populous country in the world, with the largest diaspora as well. Across the country, there are 22 official languages, with hundreds more being recognized and thousands of dialects being spoken. The country hosts over 700 ethnicities and is the birthplace of Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and Jainism. Its history traces back thousands of years to the Indus Valley civilization, one of the earliest in human history, and in modern times has become independent from Britain since 1947. Now, with that being said, I would like to delve into the conversation, and thank you, Baiju, for joining in.
So thank you, Robin, for inviting me for this wonderful conversation session. This is really fascinating. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
So as we've talked before, in the beginning, I would like to look a bit back and see how psychology and the view on human psyche developed in India. And with that history, I'm sure we could fill an entire episode on the origins of that. But if we limit ourselves to modern day psychology for the start, it still goes back over 100 years. So that puts us in the time of British rule. And I was wondering, how did that environment shape the human psyche and psychological thought?
Right. That's a wonderful question. When we had a conversation earlier also, when you look at psychology in India, one of the biggest challenge as researchers and academicians, what we face is we have multiple psychologies here. So, one psychology, of course, as you rightly mentioned, which started almost 2000 years back, which has a very strong roots in the culture of India, especially the Indian continent, which is focusing more on different philosophical questions. For instance, when we look at the questions raised by Plato, Aristotle, and many other Greek philosophers, so almost there are many contemporary thinkers in India, those who try to address the same question. So we have a very, very long history of that. But that psychology is not developed as a separate branch then and there. Especially those psychology we can find in philosophy, theology, and various other disciplines. That was not existed as a separate branch in India, right? But the modern psychology started in India. Probably we have very short history, like 100 years plus history we have. It started, probably we can say, some of the initiatives from some scholars. They went abroad and they have studied psychology, especially some of the names I need to mention here, like in 1916, N.N. Sengupta, he trained outside India And he came back to India and established a university in Calcutta. So that is probably we can consider as a beginning of psychology as a discipline, has a separate existence in India. But before psychology come to existence in India, maybe we can look at psychiatry. The psychiatry came to India along with the colonial history. So when you look at in India, more than 1700 onwards, we have the colonial legacy in India. So psychology come to existence, as I mentioned before, psychology, psychiatry especially came to existence as part of the colonial legacy. Then again, a parallel psychology came that is called the psychoanalytically oriented psychology, which is the effort of Girinder Shekhar Bose. He kind of parallelly developed a psychology, a psychoanalysis, which is parallel to the Freudian psychoanalysis. He was, of course, trying to communicate and converse with Freud, but they never got a chance to meet each other. But there was a parallel psychoanalysis he established that is probably considered as one of the oldest psychoanalytical societies in the world. So that is the first part of the modern psychology came to existence in India. So then probably there are many efforts came from different other scholars, especially the post-independence in 1950. The prime minister of that time, Jawaharlal Nehru, was very much interested to bring more Western knowledge and the modern, understanding to address many questions in India. But interestingly, the psychology in India, in the initial phase, tried to imitate the kind of questions raised by the Western scholars in a different cultural context. And there was no very specific or a new theories come from India itself. It's mostly like an imported knowledge from the West. And when we try to imitate those questions here, we try to find answers to those questions in the Indian context. So that is something, the beginning part of psychology, when you look at the history of psychology in India. Yeah.
Mm. Thank you so much for expanding
Yeah.
on that.
Yeah.
And it does make a lot of sense how you lay it out, why the Indian psychology started as it did. And over the following years into today's world, those cultural elements came more and more important. Do you maybe want to add a few things, how that change came to be and how research shifted?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the research in general, many significant social issues, especially after independence, one of the major problems faced in India was a partition. India and Pakistan, the partition happened. So that created a lot of even communal issues, communal problems, communal hatred. Some of the effort especially in social psychology research, was trying to understand why and what is the reasons of this communal hatred and communal violence. And there are many questions about the attitudinal research. We can find a lot of attitudinal research, especially in the initial part, and also some effort to implement experimental psychology here, because these are the questions almost developed in the West, and West is very much interested to understand these questions. Since we don't have any specific focus in India, it's completely a new discipline. So psychology in India tried to imitate those questions. So one of the scholars mentioned that so always the imitation has certain impact. So the the donor country is always one step ahead than the receiving country. So there was very less possibility of developing a independent psychology in India. That is one of the crises what we faced. In the initial phase, And even we are continuing the same crisis even today.
Mm.
Yeah,
Interesting how those things keep influencing us in so much later on.
yeah,
And you also mentioned it briefly before, and of course, it is the field that you are most versed in. Uh, Culture has also played a huge part in that, and I think it makes a good shift
yeah,
to
yeah.
coming to your work, since culture is a very popular term and has dozens of meanings. Would you like to explain what culture means in your research, how you define it, and what its worth is to understanding the psyche?
So many times we have a very strange connection between psychology and culture. It is not only in India. When you look at the history of psychology in the world, we could see this strange sort of a connection. Girishwar Misra mentioned about this in a very interesting analogy he used. He said the culture and psychology are intimate enemies. I like that quote. I often say that because sometimes we can see that psychology fall in love with culture. Sometimes we completely ignore culture, right? One best example, we could say, the first experimental laboratory established by William Wundt in Leipzig. He extensively talk about this interface, how our mental processes are framed by the community and society and cultural aspect. But we didn't pay much attention to that. When you look at the throughout the history, we can see that then almost there are many researchers did work in 1930s, and or there are a couple of work you can see. Then after 1 or 2 decades, it's completely untouched. No one talk about it. So that's why it's very interesting to see this analogy. There is a kind of a love and hate relationship exists between psychology and culture. Sometimes we are fall in love with culture. Sometimes we are kind of very detached from this interface. Probably in the history of psychology, this contribution is more actively came in 1980s. Once again, psychology fall in love with culture, which is the work by Schroeder from the University of Chicago. He coined the term cultural psychology. And parallelly in India, um, a psychoanalytically oriented psychologist, Dr. Sudhir Kakar, he coined the term Indian cultural psychology. I mean, that looked at different questions in psychology from a cultural point of view. So I felt sometimes the culture is a very an invisible presence in all of our behavior. Many times we are not really tracing it. It is unknown to us. But it plays a huge role when you look at in abnormal behavior, when you look at in psychopathology, when you look at in social psychology, when you look at in different other branches and field in psychology. Culture is an invisible presence. So unfortunately, we are not tackling that invisible presence. So we are less sensitive about the cultural nuances, and we are focusing more on universality in our behavior. That is something I find it is a major crisis point, a challenging point, which we need to deliberate as researchers and academicians.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense looking at it that way. So you have incorporated it quite to an extent in your research, also in combination with things like migration and love and relationships. How do you make use of it, and what do you see its strengths in explaining things about topics like that?
I think these are different questions. So we need to address each of these questions differently. So some of my area of interest is one, of course, as you mentioned about the indigenous healing practices and traditions. How that indigenous understanding or how the indigenous beliefs and systems are influencing our day-to-day decision making. and our engagement as an individual, and especially when you look at the mental health questions, how this indigenous knowledge is impacting us, right? If you look at that specific question, I remember some of the incidents which impacted me when I was a child. I was born in a village. So there I remember there was an incident where one of the member in my extended family suffered with depression. I can understand that's depression now. So the first solution for that problem is inviting a shaman. I still remember a shaman came home. He was just an ordinary man. But after a few minutes, he wore his costumes and he started chanting certain mantras. Then he looks very powerful. And everyone started seeking his blessing. And he talked in very strange language. And he approached to the person who was suffering with the depression and said, "You are torturing my child." He was talking to the spirit. He said, "You're torturing my child. Get out from my child's body." Right? So he looked very powerful, and he was creating a different sort of, environment there. Probably when I look at why I started interest in developing the shamanic practices or indigenous beliefs, probably some of these experiences played a significant role, right? To understand. So it is not my own experience. This is, of course, this is my experience, but there is very similar experience we can find in each and every uh, part of India, each and every corner of India, we can see similar things. So it is ignored because people consider it superstitious and we don't need to understand. But even today, there is a very good percentage of people go to shaman, a mystic, or a traditional healer when they are experiencing certain crisis in their life. That means even in 21st century, even today, people have a very strong belief in such kind of practices. That means it is very much rooted in the psyche of people. So, as a researcher, as an academician, I recognize, I realize that it is my responsibility to understand this. So, why people are going there and what is their benefit out of it? Why, after all this, kind of awareness created, still where these beliefs are still intact in the psyche of people. That is where I found the importance of understanding the psychocultural elements in various indigenous healing practices. When you look at the second area, especially we talk about the relationship, another important area, because when you look at the India, especially last 1 or 2 decades, we are going through a major shift from a very traditional joint family system to nuclear family. Then the whole idea of dating came in place. The dating apps are very popular now, and this is something what Europe or North America experienced probably 1 decade back, right? So something transition, especially when you look at the kind of adults and emerging adults, this shift is very fast, and that's creating a lot of impact in various ways in terms of defining the relationship. When you talk about the short-term relationship, long-term relationship, dating relationships, love, family, this is something we are going through. As I mentioned, it's a transitional culture. We are in a transitional phase. So that is where I try to look at the relationship in this transitional phase. How this happening? What is the intricacies of that? What is the process in that? And what kind of impact is creating in the society? And is there any major cultural shift happening or not? When you look at culture, is more in comparatively not that easy to change, right? It may take a couple of years, or sometimes we say many decades. We don't change much in culture, but now what you can see is the cultural change is happening much faster than in the previous time. So that's where I'm interested to study about the relationship, especially the intimacies and its dynamics.
That's fascinating to hear, and I guess also everybody's listening is very curious. What kind of findings did you get in looking at these cultural shifts in India?
Something so far what in most of my research piece, if I say that structurally, even today, the changes are not really visible. The structure, when you look at the intimacy structures and you look at the kind of engagement, there is no major change. But behaviorally, there is a lot of change happening. This itself is creating a kind of conflict because what people are trying to do and what they believe is very different. There's a contradiction between their values. I'm talking about the values, which is very, very internal. Maybe externally, people are talking about, especially when you look at the youngsters, so they're talking about the freedom and their exploration in life and all. But they are in a conflict. They are not completely shifted to the framework what we are seeing in the West because there are different reasons. One is they're too much dependent economically, they're too much dependent on their parents. That also contribute a major factor because finally when they are become the decision makers, they need to, I mean, more listen to them or they need to go to some of the instructions given by the parents. So the economic independence or freedom is not there even today's youths. So that what I'm trying to say is that there is a they're living in a contradiction and they're living these two realities. One is the realities coming from the previous generation, primarily their parents, especially look at the emerging adults and the young adults. At the same time, they are more exposed to more globally available realities about relationship and intimacies. So they're in a confusion. So what they need to take and how they need to proceed, how they have to convince, and sometimes they themselves are not very convinced about that. That is some of the findings emerging from few studies. Yeah.
That is an interesting find indeed.
Yep.
So now, because you're not only a researcher, I would also like to take some time to highlight your other works. And just recently, you have also published a film which highly emphasizes on the culture and especially indigenous cultures found in where you're from, Kerala. And how was that not just writing, but also creating media about the thing that you care about?
Yep. Thank you for talking about my film. So this is we recently published the film called Theel Gurutha Devangal. That is the Malayalam, title, but the English title is The Gods from Inferno. So this particular film based on my travel to a particular ritual dance form called Theyyam. Theyyam is a ritual dance which prevailed in northern part of Kerala, that's in the South India. So this is a very interesting art form and ritual dance form where more than 1,000 years old practice. So here the interesting part is when the performers, when once they wear the costumes, so they consider that particular time they are the deities, so they're the god. So there are more than 400 types of Theyyam. This Theyyam actually kind of interact with the people and try to resolve their problem. So the people go to Theyyam to resolve many of their problems. But when I do research on this particular ritual dance practice, I was amazed with the beauty of these visuals. So, as a documentary maker, when I look at the color what they have used, the costume what they have used, the kind of ambience they have created, that's something real visual treat. So that time onwards, I was thinking about I wanted to make something, a film on this. That's one part of it. And then as an actor, I looked at their acting skills. I really bow down to the great acting skills of this Theyyam performers. They are great actors. They are great martial artists. And they are very much fascinated with the stories of each Theyyam. is talk about how an ordinary man or woman become a deity. What is the story? The narratives of each Theyyam performance are pretty strong, you know. So when I felt about this, I touched by the stories, I witnessed these practices. I really wanted to see how the urban world and what is their narrative about this. So my documentary is primarily trying to look at this interaction between the Theyyam and the urban realities. Because we have a completely different realities, and what is the reality of Theyyam? And where is this conversation happening? So that is the effort of this particular documentary film, Theel Kurutha Deivangal, The Goats from Inferno. Luckily, this was screened in a couple of documentary film festivals, and we received well jury mention and all. I request all of you to watch, and it's available in various platforms. Yeah. But it's like my understanding as a cultural psychologist and a documentary filmmaker and actor and script writer come in one place. So I'm happy that I was able to create that. Thank you for talking
Mm.
about it. Yeah.
Right, it does sound really interesting how also all these things go in together. And speaking of acting, that's also one field that you are active in yourself. And maybe you can also say a few lines on your playback theater that took on the Mahabharata from psychological perspective in terms of the characters.
Yeah. Right. So these are two different things. One is the playback theater is something. My role is as an actor. I'm a playback theater actor. So which is focusing on the stories of people. You know, we all have stories. We all have multiple stories. Some stories are very revealing. Some stories are very intense. Some stories are happy stories, sad stories. So life is the ocean of various stories, right? So this playback theater is actually a form developed in New York by Jonathan Fox and Joe Salis, a couple in 1970s, and they wanted to create something a spontaneous theater, an improvisational theater. So people come and share their story, and they can choose the actors, and the actors listen to the stories, and they spontaneously they improvise their stories and play it back to them. So my interest in that form is majorly the stories always fascinates me. The depth of these stories and how people make sense from their own stories. What the stories are echoing in their life, how the stories are echoing in the culture, society. So that's actually a psychological process. And also as an actor, this is also when you want to spontaneously enact, we need to develop a deep listening. And deep listening is something, a concept in psychology, but we're actually practicing in theater. So when somebody's sharing a story, they may be sharing certain things in words, but there are much more deeper layers of that story. So when you pay attention to the story deeply, non judgmentally, only then we will be able to understand the real story. So, what is representing in the story, that is what we call the telling, and what is told, what is actually happened, sometimes may be slightly different. So, we always need to navigate between this told and telling through the process of deep listening. So my fascination, especially coming from the acting part of it, and especially I like to hear stories of people.
Mhm.
And the Mahabharata project is, an interesting project. We look at. There also my role is not as a director. I'm an actor. Our role was to understand one of the epic called Mahabharata, one of the great epic in India, based on a concept called positive emotional intelligence. There are different saboteurs or voices within us. These voices are always happening in our head, right? So when you are doing this podcast, you are, thinking about, there are voices in your head. Is it perfect? Is it perfect? What is going to speak? And I'm trying to make certain kind of voices happening in my head, you know. This particular theory look at almost 10 or 9 or 10 sabotages. There is something called victims, there is something called perfectionists. Sometimes we have vigilance and different voices in our head. So we try to analyze each characters in Mahabharata, the key characters in the Mahabharata, using these sabotages when they took important decisions in their life. For example, if you are familiar with the Mahabharata story, there are stories in some of the contexts where some important decision when they are taking in their life. What was the sabotage predominantly in their head? What voices they listened to? So this is what our attempt to look at the key characters like Arjuna, Krishna, Bhima. I was doing the role of Bhima. He's one of the most strongest character in Mahabharata, the strongest man in the story. But he was completely lost with his vulnerability or his love to his partner Draupadi. But she never paid attention to him. She was always interested in other characters. So he was living in that vulnerability. So what was happening in his head during the vulnerability? The most powerful man was actually the most vulnerable person. So this is something interesting thing we try to explore through Mahabharata project. We are using body theater, Kalaripaitu, that's one of the traditional martial arts, and different other forms we are trying to approach Mahabharata. So that's about the Mahabharata project. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing from these very different but equally interesting projects that you are involved in. I took some extra time for that. Unfortunately, we have already reached the end of this episode. I'm very glad that you have joined in and shared with us all those things. If any of our listeners is interested to know more or get in touch with you, how can they most easily find you?
They can find me in various social media platforms. They can find me, they can mail me, they can visit my website www.baijugopal.com, or they can look at my Insta page or Facebook page, other platforms where they can find me.
Wonderful. I'll make sure to link to all your accounts in the show notes. And thanks to you for joining me in this conversation on India and its psyche. And thanks to everybody who is listening for your interest. If you want to hear more perspectives from Asia about the human mind, please join in again in a fortnight when I will have a researcher from the Philippines on the show here. Now I would like to conclude and give the last word to Baiju. Please take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to talk to you, Robin. It's a great effort to bring the perspective of Indian psychology in perspective to the world. That's something really appreciated. Thank you so much.